they do that and the data and just to watch the data that they collect and that kind of thing. But each to his own. I can understand why you wouldn't want. I'm not really a risk taker in that kind of way, but I think I would find that would be fascinating. But all that to say, a hurricane in itself has a low pressure, as part of its system, and they actually measure that. And depending on the size, I think it's the lower the pressure, the stronger the storm. And so as a result of that, that's kind of something that you watch as they categorize them, one, two, three, et cetera, et cetera. But all that to say, in a storm of that magnitude, that's the other thing I find fascinating is the pictures on TV now. You can you see the width of the storm and the circulation and all that. It's just so neat to be able to do that to me and fascinating. Although obviously the outcomes of hurricanes are never usually good. But all that, we put that out there around the storm itself, usually because of the low pressure that's involved in it, it's kind of clear on the outside. So when it hits, there's that old saying, a calm before the storm. And that's a real dynamic, particularly with a hurricane, because the low pressure creates a high pressure out around it, and it creates kind of a nice weather before the storm actually comes to shore, so to speak. I was thinking about that just because that's on the news and because of the story that we're about to look at. Life seems like it's full of storms and then peaceful times and then storms and peaceful times, and sometimes the storm is unrelenting, and sometimes there's seems like a long stretch where there's a sense of peace. And so, it compares to our faith. And the faith that we had for the storms of yesterday helped us get through yesterday's storms. We don't really know what's on the horizon, do we? As we look into the week to come, we don't know what storms may hit. And as a result, we don't know what kind of faith is going to be required of us to weather that kind of storm. Only God knows that. And in fact, only He can help us adjust our faith or deepen our faith to meet the oncoming circumstance that may be around the corner. We have confidence that He can do that. And we place our trust in Him as we think about that and think about just the interaction. So yesterday's faith, well, that helped us yesterday, but sometimes we have to be challenged to face a new storm, a new circumstance, and it causes our desire deeper faith and trust in of the woman of Zarephath here in our story. I do know that she came through a storm last week. And that storm was she was out of food. In face of the famine that had hit the land, she had used up all the resources that she humanly had available to her and was literally preparing her last meal for her and for her son. And as she prepared it, she was going to eat it. And then she had in her mind determined that she was going to die. That was quite a storm. That was quite a storm. And yet the scripture portrays her, even in the midst of a godless culture that she was in a godless area, in an area that would not have acknowledged the God of Israel, the living and true and one and only God. She was portrayed, if you remember, as a woman of faith. And so as Elijah went to her, it wasn't her faith that was questioned at that point. She was just living out her life even as we do. It was another experience, and she had exhausted all her means, but she was open to something that God might do for her. And as a result, when Elijah showed up, she was skeptical, if you recall, but she wasn't closed. And at the end, she surrendered her will and did what he asked, and God affirmed her in her faith. And the flour that she used never stopped being provided, and the jar of oil that she used to mix it to make the cakes, never ran dry. And the promise was until there would be rain in the land. So this was now her experience. In one sense, the storm was past, and she was in this calm place when others didn't have food. She was being provided for by the living and true God in a supernatural way, supporting both herself, her son, and the man who was now a guest in her home, the prophet, the man of God. How good is that? How good is that? So I don't know where you are in this context this morning of storms, no storms, peace, no peace. Perhaps last week you came and all was calm, and this week it's like the world has turned upside down. Perhaps last week the world was turned upside down, but this week you are here praising God for the place that He has you, and I don't know where you are. Is there a major difference in your life this week? Is there something that's changed? Sometimes the weeks run together because there's a sameness, and other times life has a way of pushing us, sometimes dramatically and suddenly. And so we have an understanding of that, but it is in the midst of that, I believe, that God deepens our faith, that He pushes us to places that we would not push ourselves by the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I believe that's what this story reveals to us. It shows us that God uses the most important items and things, circumstances in our life to deepen our faith in Him. And so I would like you to engage with me as we look at the testimony of the woman from Zarephath as she lived out another experience in her life. It's just fascinating to me that this lady has this much scripture. I mean, she's just living there by the sea, by the Mediterranean Sea, kind of minding her own business in the culture that she's in, and yet this is who God has this lengthy 2 stories about, and we don't really hear from her again. She goes on her life after this experience, and Elijah moves on and attacks King Ahab and all that's involved there, but there's this brief parenthesis. Both of these stories in her life are rather dramatic. Both of them are linked by death itself. Like that's kind of the theme that runs. Not one that we like to focus on, and yet, but her life was one challenging experience followed by another. We don't know. We don't know how long the length of peace was between when she thought she was going to die because of lack of food to the point that this story started today. We know that this one today came out of nowhere. It was very sudden. And that's just like the circumstances that we face. And it brings us to the first point. The faith of yesterday is challenged by the circumstances of today. Is that not true? The faith of yesterday, when you're challenged by a new storm, by a new circumstance, by something in your life that you have no answer for, sometimes you think, or don't even think about how you conquered it yesterday or how God provided for you yesterday, because it's such a new and demanding challenge in your life, and you may find yourself in that place today. We even described this woman, and we touched on it earlier, that she was a woman that you could say had great faith to trust God to provide for her. And she had a brief respite. She had a brief time of peace from one brush of death to all of a sudden she was interacting again with this challenging circumstance that her son faces. For he grows ill, and his illness, maybe innocent at first, continued to grow